Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, desolators, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks, the resistance. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go to the Not So Good USA and talk about where the liberal base is at right now. And it's really interesting for me to see this phenomenon, particularly because I went back on Facebook recently and I got to see it up close and personal, full brunt of it, and what kind of things are going on out there in the so-called liberal resistance that's going on right now in this anti-Trump movement. We've seen a lot of dramatic results of it, but and all the protests and the violence and everything, and it's been fascinating to watch. And one of the things that's been disconcerting about it is seeing the liberal base become what they have been critical of all these years. And so I've been haggling with that for the last 8 years under the Barack Obama administration and doing videos and observing what the conservative base was doing, including the so-called Tea Party movement and the like. And I always kind of felt like at least the liberal base seemed to be somewhat more polite, a little more educated, and all these other assumptions about the base. But as it turns out, they're no better than anyone else, and in fact, they've become a parody of themselves, unfortunately. And so it's my notes are kind of all over the map, so I'm going to try and make this as coherent as I can. But to my eyes, the liberal base has joined the dark side. And one of the ways that it manifests itself is, first of all, they're willing to take all this so-called news that's coming out at face value. And so even though a lot of these stories have been debunked and a lot of it's published, even as speculation, the idea that Trump was getting golden showers and collaborating with the Russians and all this nonsense that's come out, the liberal base has been eating it up. And even after it gets debunked, the damage is already done, and those stories continue to make the rounds. One of them was a fake meme about supposedly an interview that Trump had in People magazine in 1998 or 1991, depending on which one you got, saying that if Trump supposedly quoted as saying that if he ran, he would run as a Republican because the Republican base is so stupid. And of course, it's a total hoax, but nobody does the research and passes that around, and everybody has a good laugh about it. And that's part of it too, is just the ugliness of all this, the talk about the divisiveness of Trump and the divisiveness of the Republicans, and yet the liberal base turns around and uses the most horrible terminology and the worst caricatures and just very hateful and spiteful and ugly propaganda and stuff that they send around that's very divisive, and yet they continue to talk about divisiveness. One example of that, of course, is a piece that went around describing America as the parts of America that voted for Hillary as being America and the rest of the country as being dumb fuckistan. And so that's part of the divisiveness, inconvenient divisiveness that the liberals base seems to embrace when they describe half the country as dumb fuckistan. And that echoes the same way the conservative base used to treat liberals, always talking about how half the country, the liberals, hated America and that only conservatives loved America. And so that was a bunch of hooey, and I just don't buy that kind of distinction. And so the liberals embrace that same sort of thing. And they also act like this divisiveness is something new, whereas the country has always been divided. If you look at historically, there's plenty of examples of the United States being divided in a lot of ways, and you can do it on a local level too. People from South Seattle, the way they feel about people in North Seattle, and people that are Seahawks fans, the way compare themselves to Raiders fans, and there's all kinds of ways that people can divide themselves into these subgroups. But in the United States, of course, we have urban areas that have been at odds with rural areas. A good example of that is how the politics of Seattle dominates the state of Washington, even though we have an entire rural area in eastern Washington that has completely different political ideology. But in America, we had the Whigs versus the Tories, and the Royalists versus people, the Revolutionaries, the North Federalists versus the Southern Democrats. Northern Yankees versus the Southern Confederates, and then Midwest and South agrarian populace versus Northeast and industrial and banking. And we still have a lot of those dynamics in place now. So there's always been a certain amount of divisiveness, and so people like Trump are a symptom of that. They're not necessarily the cause, and it's easy to see that dynamic right now. This whole divisiveness issues taking on a life of its own. And another way that the liberals are joining the dark side is the fact that everyone has a record level of distrust for the media, and yet when the media panders and delivers the kind of message that the liberal base wants to hear, they think the media is to be completely trusted, even though, like I say, we're at all-time levels of distrust, and that includes celebrities. Why there's so much trust by the liberal base in these fickle celebrities. Celebrities talking, these pampered, insulated aristocracy of the United States, celebrities talking about gun violence, and then having all these movies that are full of nothing but gun violence, and so and nobody sees the hypocrisy there. And then to see people like Madonna and Ashley Judd coming out there and giving these hysterical speeches and being cheered on. I mean, so that's the kind of stuff I expect from Michelle Bachmann and some crazy right-wingers, but instead we're seeing it from the liberal base. Another reason why the liberal base has joined the dark side is because they misplaced their anger in a lot of ways. For example, the number of people that didn't vote who were registered Democrats because they got complacent and thought that Hillary was a shoo-in, so they didn't need to bother to vote, and discounting the fact that the conservative base was very motivated, and yet not only are a lot of people that didn't vote are out protesting now, which is seems a little unfair and disingenuous. If you didn't vote, I'm not sure how much right you have to protest, voting being a form of protest. And then the fact that we have documentation from these leaked emails that the Hillary campaign completely screwed over Bernie Sanders. And where's the liberal outrage about the Hillary campaign screwing over Bernie Sanders? And there isn't any, so that seems to be pretty disingenuous and a lot of hypocrisy. Hillary's campaign could be claimed to be illegitimate in a lot of ways. The Democrats rigged the primaries, the complete questionable characteristics of the superdelegate system, the fact that there's outrage that the emails were leaked, but not outrage about the fact that the content was all true, all the campaign financing issues. A lot of laws were broken, particularly involving the DNC and the manipulation of the campaign. The fact that the media was a big part of the Clinton campaign and was on their side of the Clinton campaign during the election cycle and continues to be. And then the corruption of the Democratic National Committee in total. There should be some liberal outrage about that, but for some reason there's not. And so anyway, so there's no outrage about campaign manipulation in general. We keep going back to this whole thing about Russian manipulation, and all the claims about this Russian manipulation continue to be the focal point, even though so much of it has been debunked and the connections are tenuous at best. And one of the other things that's funny is the number of liberals that are out buying guns and talking about secession. This is also a repeat of 8 years of the Obama administration, when the conservatives are out buying lots of guns, and secession movements were started in all 50 states. I actually did a video about that. And so now it's funny to see the liberal base adapt these same policies. And then all the violence. We had a lot of agent provocateurs and a lot of people trying to start violence during the campaign, and then talk about how violent the Trump campaign was. But a lot of the violence is being perpetrated by agent provocateurs, was being perpetrated by liberals attending these events. And then we see the same violence in this resistance movement, including this crazy violence that happened down at Berkeley, that riot. And so anyway, this whole discussion about the violence and divisiveness and and racism of the conservatives, and yet it's the liberal base that's out there perpetrating all kinds of violence. And that brings up another thing too, is the whole idea that the liberal base used to be anti-war, and so they were anti-war during the Bush administration, and then you could hear crickets chirp in the 8 years of the Obama administration, and a lot of these wars were going on, and new wars were happening, and yet the liberal base disappeared and are no longer anti-war. And now Trump is president, and all of a sudden the liberal base is anti-war again. And in fact, there's extra scrutiny to these strikes by the Trump administration in Yemen, for example, and yet thousands of these strikes went on during the Barack Obama administration, and there was no liberal outcry. And then we have all the craziness that happened during the Obama administration, the base believing in the fake birth certificate, the idea that Obama was illegitimate because he was born in Kenya, and that the entire government was overrun by members of the Muslim Brotherhood and all this nonsense. And so that was all good for a laugh for 8 years under Obama. Now we have the liberal base believing all this Russian boogeyman stuff and all the golden showers and every little people questioning his mental sanity and all this other stuff, and so the liberal base is enjoying wallowing in the bottom of the barrel, much the same way the conservative base did with all that nutty stuff under 8 years of Obama. So now liberal base is doing the same thing, and then the other thing is that the liberal base is forgetting that a lot of the GOP, status quo GOP, feels the same way about Trump that they do. So the liberal base wants to talk about it's somehow a partisan thing between the Democrats and the Republicans, and yet we have a huge part of the GOP status quo, both the base and the members of the government, who do not support Trump and will continue to undermine him as well. So interesting to see the liberal base champion people like Lindsey Graham and John McCain, these warmongers, and Dick Cheney, and even waxing nostalgically about George Bush, all these neocon warmongers, just because they come out and criticize Trump. So a very strange universe that we've entered, and also the supposed inclusiveness and diversity of the liberal base and their claim of values, and yet they claim that a lot of the country are so-called deplorables, and that they're hillbillies and that they live in Dumbfuckistan. And so anyway, as always, it's just a boutique discussion of divisiveness and racism, and they don't really want to talk about real issues. And also, I think people need to keep in mind that there's some legitimate concerns, and it's not just racism. I think a lot of mothers and fathers and people who live in rural communities and Christian communities and communities all over the U.S. have the right to not want men dressed as women to be in their bathrooms. And I know it's all kind of PC to want to have all kinds of inclusiveness and diversity, but I think there's a legitimate right for a lot of old-fashioned values that liberals are fond of criticizing. In fact, I was thinking the other day how interesting it is that I have a lot of liberal friends who are musicians who've spent their lives criticizing people who like pop music and who like disco music and who like dance music and who like what they consider crappy music, and they're fairly elitist about it. And yet, once again, that diversity is relative. One can always find a reason to criticize what you can perceive as the so-called other side. And another part of this too is the hypocrisy, the party line drones particularly. So now we have liberal base who's going crazy about some of Trump's suggestions about immigration, yet you don't have to go back too far in history and find a lot of examples of Democrats who supported all kinds of things, including an increase in border guards and building of a wall, and the fact that we needed to do something about illegal immigrants. In fact, it's been passed around the 1995 State of the Union address by Bill Clinton. He got a standing ovation, basically discussing the same policies that Trump is talking about now, and yet now they're horrifying and fascist policies, and yet under Bill Clinton, for some reason, the liberal base thought those ideas were great. Another example of that too is, granted, Trump is very tactless and has made fun of disabled people on a number of occasions, but I find that to be true of most candidates. I've seen John McCain do the same thing, and in fact, there's a clip of Barack Obama talking about how his golf game made him look like he was from the Special Olympics, and yet there's no outrage. So that, as always, there's selective outrage and cherry picking, and so that's just what we've come to expect, and it's just unfortunate to see the liberal base now become just as uninformed as anyone else. And for example, there was record deportations under the Barack Obama administration, and most of the liberal base are ignorant of that fact. And so now we have Trump talking about deportations and getting rid of the worst, and yet we have precedents with Bill Clinton and Barack Obama doing the same thing, and yet it is not an issue. And so now we have the fact too that there was no resistance the last 8 years, and now there's all this talk about resistance, and I just find it ironic because there's talk about an oligarchy and a deep state, and in fact Amazon's recently sold out in 1984, and I'm thinking, where have these people been? They should have been resisting the last 8 years. The oligarchy doesn't take a break when their favorite president is in office. The oligarchy and the deep state is always there. It's continuous, and the idea now that somehow the oligarchy and the deep state is back in play and took a break during the 8 years of the Obama administration is pretty funny. So anyway, the whole resistance movement, like I say, is just seems a little ironic right now when the last 8 years were a missed opportunity. And I guess in some ways I should say better late than never, but it's kind of hard to look at it that way. And like I say, the bottom line is seeing the kind of the level of hate we're seeing now is giving a pass. Not only do we have police not making a lot of arrests and standing down during a lot of the protests, but we have all kinds of violence being incited, including a Seattle preschool teacher out yelling to Black Lives Matter protesters that, quote, we need to start killing people, we need to start killing the White House, unquote. And then she went on to say, quote, the White House must die, your fucking White House, your fucking presidents, they must go, unquote. And I know it's easy to cherry pick these particular incidents, but the fact is that these incidents are happening, and these people are being looked upon as some sort of champions instead of being abhorrent of people who are inciting violence, and that includes teachers who have mocked assassinating Trump. The fact that we have people out here, like I say, talking about people need to be killed, and that sort of violence just is not going to go anywhere. And in fact, it turns out that a certain amount of that is backfiring, and it becomes all too easy to demonize a movement when they resort to these kind of tactics. But anyway, there we have it. Just kind of broad strokes. It's hard to do this topic justice, but the liberal base is really kind of missing the point, and unfortunately the resistance has so many issues they want to address now that it's going to dissipate the energy. The methods and rhetoric they're using really aren't going to go too far in a lot of ways, and the fact is the last 8 years was a missed opportunity for resistance, and to start now is a little late. I'm a useful idiot, don't you be one too.